Madam Chair, there needs to be a shift in this debate. This debate is not about protecting the individuals that chose to forego the rights of other individuals. This debate is about protecting the most vulnerable who have been harmed by those individuals. It needs to be said, ladies and gentlemen, that the ability to change does not equal to the ability to heal the rest of society, which we have put undue damage to. I think that government was very, very convenient. They wanted to paint this picture of an idea of the criminals in society of having no choice but to commit the crimes that they've had. I'm going to disprove that right now. First of all, he said there's a primary goal to release people back into society. Another primary goal of the justice system is also to give closure and deterrence to the rest of criminals so that they do not do the same thing. Why is it that we think that criminals have an opt out? Because of the fact of the matter is that the environment they grow up in, there are already people choosing to go into that opt out. You don't have to be a gang member. There are jobs available to you. They might be less lucrative, but the government also recognizes the fact that less lucrative things are not justified. This is why when opening government comes up, they only talk about theft, because the idea of way more lucrative criminal activities are unjustifiable because crime is unjustifiable. Things like kidnapping, things like ransomed bombings, right? They're all faster ways to accumulate cash, but we don't distinguish between them because there are no distinguishments between them because they do hurt people in the end. The old guy in their world chose to go to the prison. He chose to take his anger out on the rest of society. We say that the criminal sentencing needs only one response from the government, is that to recognize the delineation between the good and the bad. What are we for under opening opposition? I'll take one later. We are for set prison sentences. We think that if they can caveat a just and very fair mode of measuring rehabilitation, we are going to push for just prisons instead. We are going to regulate things like gang violence within those prisons. We'll make it sanitary. We'll make sure they're well fed. We'll make sure that if you want to believe that the government can live in a world where there is a sound rehabilitation system, we can live in a world where there is a sound jail system instead. We are going to back up every dollar they have to also implement things into like the court system and stuff like that. And we will still sentence based on mitigatory factors. We think that is sufficient. Everything opposition gives you from this point on is derivative of these concepts. The positioning in this debate that we'll take is that it is not a burden to defend Baroque justice systems. And we say this debate is about rehab versus rehabilitation plus deterrence. We have two alternatives on our side. They only have one. We have two arguments for you today. Number one, how is it that we protect the sanctity of the legal system and why is that necessary? In principle, the legal system's sole goal is to protect the individuals who have reciprocated these rights. These are individuals who respect the state's ability to cater for them. These are circumstances that the state, regardless of how these criminals were created, they still took out their anger on somebody else's life. This happens in all instances of crime. Three layers of analysis: drugs, harm, and theft. It doesn't, first on drugs. It doesn't matter whether you just purchase these drugs or whether you sold these drugs, because you do a few things within your community. Number one, by consumption or selling these drugs, you incentivize individuals to be much more dangerous and act out on kind of crimes when they are under that state. But another thing you do is you invite crime to that neighborhood and you perpetuate the idea that it's now a selling ground for these drugs. We think those things harm the people around you. Those people deserve compensation. At the second level of harm, things like rape and murder and all kinds of harm, we will argue, under crime, are irreversible circumstances. They cause you to refuse trust in trusting other people in your personal relationships, or being able to move forward in your life because you suffered trauma. Even if you just got robbed, we are willing to argue that that is a traumatic experience that must be reciprocated. Given the fact that government is going to tell you that they will posit that all criminals did not know what we were doing, we will say that criminal sentencing shows people that you are causing harm. This is the harm that you deserve. And it's also true that these people aren't exactly taking from the rich and distributing it. They are causing harm onto the same people within their social circumstance. There is no justice here. The victims are a victim of circumstances. Moving on to my second point, but before that, I'll take
Taken. back.
Point.
Why is it an insult to deterrence? First thing, delineation. There must be some sort of moral delineation between the good and the bad in society. This is why we don't punish everyone in a society, even though it's technically society's fault that a murderer is able to take place because of the neglect. Because we understand that there are different objective, varying degrees of harm that is caused, and that this is a person that has taken up the idea of that harm. But the second thing about this is, even if criminals, I think that criminals respond to a level of deterrence. So the reason why the law system is in place is to ensure other individuals don't do the same thing. Even if criminals have a certain level of getting away with the crime, there is still a big difference between a larger sentence and a shorter sentence. Of saying you have a chance of rehabilitation over things like saying you will never get out, right? This is the reason why serial killers in Nevada declined by 40% after capital punishment was enacted in the 80s. This is why, given the fact that the government would tell you what they're doing is you have to make the. Sorry, this is why in India, for instance, when people don't trust the justice system, they are willing to take out their fight and go on and do whatever they want onto other people. It doesn't only stop crime, as they would like to say, but it starts the advent of things like vigilantism, which causes more crime. We dispute that they stop any crime at all. But finally, I think there's a lopsidedness of how well you can rehabilitate. Notice that individuals who are able to rehabilitate faster have a privilege of being able to grow up in a background where they were given love, where they can understand the values of education. This means that all of these privileged rapists and all of these privileged murderers who grew up in the good schools can get out significantly faster because they are able to well rehabilitate. I also think that in accordance to things like the justice system, the reason by which you have that in place is because you trust the people within that system to enact it properly. I think this is a forego of all of the systems you have put in place to go with that. What government needs to prove to you ultimately is how exactly it is right to betray the intense levels of harm. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I have Deputy Prime Minister? Can we have Deputy Leader of Opposition?
Start.
Chair, don't let the side of government get away by painting to you a picture where the opening opposition is trying to run a world where prisons become extremely inhumane, where we don't have human rights for prisoners because apparently we are the side that don't recognize human rights. This is not what we've proposed from the very get-go. We've proposed a world where we want to revamp the entire justice system. We said that we will push the entire political will that the side of government has to revamp it and change it to rehabilitation, push it towards revamping the justice system. This looks like things like not supporting a broken justice system. We will still have rehab, counseling, not have abuse, so we don't have things like gang violence. We'll curb down on gang violence. We'll make sure prisons aren't abusive anymore. We will have actual sentences. We'll get rid of racist judges. We think all these things are possible, and we support a fair and just justice system. This isn't to say we don't support a brutal justice system that's unfair, because that was never our burden to begin. We also think we support things like reintegration after jail time, because we recognize that after a prisoner has been proportionally punished to his punishment for the crime he's committed, he still deserves a second chance. That was the burden but they said that they claimed that we took a burden, which was we want to punish that prisoner forever, but that was never our burden to begin with. We also that we will still give to prisoners who have unfortunate circumstances who they want to talk about, we will still support things like mitigation factors where we're able to judge on a case-by-case basis. But recognize what the side of government does is that this is a blanket policy for every prisoner, not recognizing the background, not recognizing if they even had to do it or not recognizing if there was even a need to, even if there was a malicious intent and no need to do this, these individuals will still go scot-free. I think that's unfair. I think that's that's unfair to every victim who was harmed by that prisoner that isn't just recognized. I think that we are start opening opposition, take a stance where the government is able to balance both, which is rehab and deterrence and closure. And I think that we achieve a perfect balance where we're able to prioritize both victims of the crime and also larger society at stake. First argument, why this is unfair for closure. Recognize that they say that closure for a victim is basically knowing that the prisoner will never commit the crime again. That is unfair to every victim who has been punished, that who, for example, in the families who have lost like their loved ones, individuals who have been raped and will never be able to move on. The individuals who cope with like constant trauma every day. I think that it's unfair and like disgusting for them to say that these individuals don't deserve proper closure and are willing to see their perpetrators just like grow scot-free just because they've rehabilitated. I think these individuals, it's only morally justified and to give them proper closure, knowing that their perpetrator has been punished, that the state recognizes their suffering, because this is literally not the state that's turning a blind eye on their suffering, because recognize this jail time doesn't mean anything. It's counseling and rehab which isn't equal to seeing the perpetrator being punished for their crime. We think this is horrible, and we think that they say that the reason why it's still closure is because some victims will be okay with it. They don't tell us the majority, what happens to the majority of victims who will still suffer and who will still be extremely angry their perpetrators go scot-free. I think this government has a state of duty to this victim because also victims of circumstances. They are victims because the government failed to protect them, the police failed to intervene. We think they still deserve some form of closure. Secondly, which is better for the long-term protection of prisoners? This is the most recognize. All the claims from government claim that prisoners will be better off on their world. I think this is untrue, because recognize reintegration can only happen insofar as the public accept these prisoners, insofar as public recognizes that they deserve a second chance. This can never happen with the fact that with the point at which the victims literally have the victim card now. Every victim who now was perpetrated can literally come out to see that they never received justice. I think that there will be a public outcry of like how the justice system has failed, how these prisoners are going away scot-free with just rehabilitation, not facing proper punishment. I think this will lead to several things. Number one, this means that now victims have got the victim card and the perpetrators will constantly be like, will constantly never be given a second chance. This goes to all levels of society because there's anger and like and the public will become extremely furious towards these prisoners. We think that this will lead to a lot of microaggressions, bad behavior towards prisoners, less empathy. This means that it's hard for government to push things like empathy towards prisoners when there's victims out there who never got justice, and the narrative is now that prisoners go away scot-free. But secondly, we think that now this leads to a massive rise of vigilante justice. This means that a lot of people take up arms attack this prisoners. Like this, we think that vigilante justice and violence towards prisoners only leads to more recidivism because there's less support within communities and societies for them to be able to accept prisoners. The narrative is shifted against them. Different on our world. We think in our world, we can twist the narrative to say these are individuals who've already properly faced their sentences, which are fair and also been rehabilitated. And now once they're done with their sentences, they come out. We think that the public are more likely to accept these prisoners, and governments can still shift the narrative on they can say that they deserve a second chance because they've already faced justice. The second extension on deterrence, as on your world. For a lot of individuals, I think that it's important to note that a lot of times individuals who commit crimes often tend to be from the same socio-economic background. This is African Americans because they're exposed to gang violence. When there's a massive amount of these individuals, because recognize their incarceration rate is higher, when there's a massive amount of these individuals going into prison and then being let out scot-free, I think there's a larger narrative towards these individuals that they are the ones who are going out scot-free. This leads to things like more racism, less policies towards being able to help these people, like to be able to improve their living conditions and deal with the root causes of them causing crime, because there's less empathy towards them from the public and more frustration. But lastly, on deterrence, recognize. I agree that some people commit crimes of passion, but for a lot of people, it's always a question of whether or not I should commit the crimes. They balance out the risk and the benefits. Even though it's still jail time, it's a lot less harsher, and I think this leads to a lot of individuals taking advantage of the justice system. Just recognize this policy doesn't take into account your background, your intention. Every Despite even though he didn't have the actual background or a need or was from an abused family, will still get away scot free. We think this is this is the government not being responsible and not being able to balance its duties. Proud to oppose.
Just give me 1 minute before you start your speech.
Okay.
Okay, you may start whenever you're ready.
All right.
Start.
Madam Chair, closing government is going to uniquely enter this debate by doing one thing. Because understand that this debate was never just about the exclusive use of rehabilitation versus the exclusive use of retribution. This was about uniquely releasing prisoners at the point at which they have been shown to be effectively rehabilitated. We are totally okay with using retribution for individuals who have not yet improved, who will still continue to pose an active and direct harm to society. Don't let opposition try and paint a false image of what our case was. So this was never about exclusive use of one over the other. This was about releasing prisoners at a point at which they've been shown to not pose a direct and continuing threat to society, right? So with that in mind, understand that this is not this debate is ultimately about how trapping everyone in prison to set prison sentences debilitates prisons. It cripples the ability for us to function productively as a prison system, to let individuals back into society in productive means. But number two, we think that it perpetuates recidivism and encourages people to recommit crime. I know that opening already said this. We're going to extensively
Point.
analyze why this is the case at the outside of the house. But understand, right? So first, a few points of rebuttal. OO had one main thing. That was the entire idea of closure, why these people deserve the ability to see their perpetrators be locked up in jail and stuff like that. Okay, understand that the criminal justice system was designed to protect the most number of individuals. That is to say that you protect people from being murdered, you protect people from being raped. How does it do this? It does this in two ways. Number one, lowering recidivism rates, and number two, by stopping future crimes. What we're going to prove to you exclusively in CG is why exactly keeping everyone in jail according to prison sentences is exactly going to perpetuate these two things. It's going to make people be involved in things like gang violence and things like bad conditions within these cells, which means that in the future, they are going to have a higher tendency to recommit their crimes, right? So we think on the principle of what the criminal justice system stands for, we are going to win this debate. But just note, right? So our setup to this is we largely agree with what opening said. That is to say that we think that this is already could be a feasible measure of rehabilitation. If it's not foolproof, we think that there will be checks and balances. So for example, we can use individuals like criminal psychiatrists, psychologists, test experiments, lawyers, and these sorts of individuals in order to ensure that these people really do not pose a direct and continuing threat to society any longer, right? What we will uniquely do is that the money that we save from locking these people up in prisons, which is extremely expensive, we are going to rechannel all this money into better means to deterring crime. What does it mean? We're going to invest more in welfare, things like aid for the poor that we think constitute the vast majority of crimes that is perpetuated in the status quo. We think this is a far more holistic and a better way in order to solve the problem that they, opposition, conceded was the main problem, crime in and of itself, right? Then, into my two main pieces of extension. Number one, why mass imprisonment debilitates prison systems and leads to a proliferation of crime. Understand firstly that mass imprisonment, that is to say that you lock individuals up according to set prison sentences, is extremely taxing on the resources of these prisons. And we think ultimately your ability for a prison to cope is based uniquely on resources. And this is the critical extension. We think that resources are crucial to their ability to function, right? What does this look like on the opposition side of the house? Hundreds of millions of dollars are continually kept in prisons in order to keep people in sentences for 10, 20, 30 years. That means that things like beds, the need for guards, things like food, shelter, and all these sorts of things are extremely taxing on the resources that you have as a prison system, right? This happens only on opposition side when you lock up millions of individuals unnecessarily. We change that on our side of the house when we release individuals who do not any longer pose a threat, right? So we think that under our side, realistically, we're going to be able to release some like 50% of citizens and therefore have 50% more resources in order to improve our prison systems, right? So what's the critical nuance within this? Prison systems already do not have sufficient resources to function. And this is structurally true, right? Because when Maya said, oh, we want to revamp the entire prison system, this cannot happen. Understand that prison systems uniquely rely on political will. We do not think you have political will because governments will always want to label their campaigns on things like healthcare, things like building up a strong army, things like prison systems are never the priority of individuals on the ground, and therefore you will never have the kind of investment that they want to get under the through revamping the system. Therefore, the only way in which you can make sure that there are more resources in order to improve and maintain a healthy prison system, one in which individuals aren't turning to like gang violence and things like that, is only when you have the limited resources you have and use them effectively. But before I continue, opening.
Taken.
Your entire extension has been based around the idea of monetary gain. Can you please engage on why exactly it is legitimate to forgive people who have neglected the rule of the state?
So what is the impact of this, right? Because understand that mass imprisonment, which deprives these prison systems of their resources, breeds hatred among prisoners and leads to a proliferation of crime. If we can prove this, that shows that none of their benefits accrue because the proliferation of crime harms more citizens under their side of the house. We think that structures of prisons which have exceeded their max capacity are characterized by a lack of space and area. That means that individuals are more likely to turn to things like gangs, like trading drugs, bullying, and attacks. These people literally, in order to survive in prison, whether or not you want to be involved in the gang, are pushed and forced into doing that because that's the only way you can survive in prison. You cannot, as a prisoner, survive on your own. You need a network of individuals on which you can rely, in which you can cheat other individuals for food, because the conditions within these prisons are just terrible, right? We think within this, that means that people who have finished serving their jail sentence do not actually feel remorse. They feel that they've been further antagonized by the states, which is why in examples of places where they use things like retribution very heavily, you have over like 50% recidivism rate in the United States. We think that's harmful. But second argument, right? This policy counteracts the stigma that overshadows ex-convicts, which currently undermines reintegration. Because understand that people finish their sentence and they have a criminal marker. The change on the outside of the house is that people can finally acknowledge that these people have been rehabilitated. That's to say that the metric by which you are released from jail is no longer whether you've served your jail sentence, but whether or not you've actually changed for the better. That public perception is important in this. For all those reasons, we're proud to stand on the side of making sure that CJS stands up to its core principles of protecting individuals on the ground. Very proud to propose.
Thank you. Can I have member of opposition, please?
May I begin? May I begin?
Yes, you may at any time that you're ready.
Start.
I'm going to be the first speaker clarifying the comparative that should be debated in today's debate. This debate is not a comparison between 100% retribution and 100% rehabilitation. We're going to clarify the comparative that CO goes for, which is the status quo. And we're going to be the first team giving you the detailed depiction of the status quo of which factors are currently considered within the CJS when it comes to a length of an individual sentence, and also clarify what will actually happen under their imaginary world if this actually becomes a reality. We're going to secondly provide you and reestablish the justification behind the criminal justice system. We're going to uniquely introduce the public by explaining how the CJS is not simply for prisoners, it's not simply for the sake of the rehabilitation of criminals, but it's also important role is to uphold the moral fabric of the society and let citizens feel safe and secure and trust the criminal justice system in general. We're going to thirdly provide you the stakeholder analysis of criminals. We're going to divide this into two demographics. We're going to first explain about the criminals which are released after a disproportionately lighter sentence. So, for example, even when you were a serial murderer, you were released like after 1 month since you were fully rehabilitated. And the second group of people, which are people which would be disproportionately sentenced for a longer time. So, for example, even when you were in prison due to a very light crime such as verbal abuse, since for some reason, since your level of rehabilitation was not enough due to government standards, you have to stay at the prison for prolonged periods of time. Problems will arise in both cases. And fourthly, we're going to explain to you why rehabilitation is hindered even under their case by explaining how the public will respond. But before moving on to that, let's refute a few points. So the OGF explained about what rehabilitation is, but quote unquote on what they have said, they have mentioned rehabilitation is basically understanding what you have done wrong, and it hasn't been clarified exactly, which means that we say that most criminals commit crimes even after realizing that a certain action is wrong. So we say that this does not lead to any of the benefits about tackling recidivism or rehabilitation that they have mentioned, because we say that oftentimes people do
Point.
not commit crime because of the fear of repercussion rather than understanding whether it was a just act to do or not. And the previous speaker talked about the problems of mass incarceration. We think that this is a problem solution mismatch. This is a problem that could be solved through other structural remedies like banning mandatory minimums or more justice on disproportionately jailing people of color or whatnot. So we think that this is an irrelevant point in today's debate. So let's firstly move on to the comparative. Let's set out what's being done in the status quo, because we're the first team literally bringing this up. So what does the CJS consider in the status quo? Mainly three things. Firstly, we currently do consider the intention behind a certain crime. So premeditated murder is more it's more heavily punished than murders which are done out of passion. And we say that when you exploit your power symmetry to coerce a person to be sexually exploited, such malicious intentions are currently considered within the criminal sentence process. And secondly, and more importantly, what we uniquely in the opposition consider more compared to the government is the damage that has been done to the society. And this is where proportionality kicks in. So even when you commit a fraud, there's a difference between committing a $100 fraud and a $10 million fraud. And a rapist that have raped one person compared to raping tens and dozens of people. So we say that this type of proportionality, it only exists under the opposition case. And this is currently one of the important pillars of the criminal justice system, to repent for the damage done to the society. And thirdly, we like to add another important characteristic and another important metric, which is whether it damages the moral fabric of the society. So we say that certain actions that violate the society's moral norms even more grossly, for example, killing a family member, it's more heavily punished than killing a stranger. So we see that such considerations are currently within our criminal justice system. And also we see that rehabilitation and considerations for rehabilitation also exists under the status quo. We have the parole system when it comes to individuals or prisoners with exceptional behavior, they get shortened prison sentences. But we see that what becomes problematic is when this rehabilitation
What happened? Okay. Oh god. Alright, do you remember up till what time you spoke for? before the timer accidentally stops. Around 4:30. Okay. We'll start the timer now, and POIs will be allowed up till the 1 minute and 30-second mark. I'll unmute and I'll clap once so that you guys are aware that the POI time has stopped. You should end your speech. Oh god. You should end your speech by 2:30. At 2:30, when the timer shows 2:30, you would have finished your 7 minutes of speech time. What you do now is you just press speech start and you just continue on with your speech like you would, and I'll clap when POI time ends. Just start whenever you're ready.
Start.
So under their imaginary world, it's likely that leaders of terrorist groups or gang rapists will be set free in a few weeks of time if it's fully proven that they're fully rehabilitated. So we say that this will lead to an overraging public response of disapproving the criminal justice system and having a lack of trust and feeling that they're betrayed by the system. We say that this all leads to harms because now it will be likely that the public would refuse to bring cases to court in the first place because they feel that the system wouldn't do them good and wouldn't serve them justice because they know that everything is extremely uncertain, and no matter what type and what extent of repercussion a criminal causes to a society, that wouldn't actually matter when it comes to carrying out the sentence. So we said that this is extremely toxic for the criminal justice system in general. And we're going to talk about the stakeholder analysis here. We say that people which are released after a disproportionately lighter sentence that is not corresponding with social norms, believe that they wouldn't be magically integrated. The public will still reject them, especially when it comes to high-profile cases that create outrage within the society. And also, when it comes to people which are disproportionately jailed for a longer time, even when it's a misdemeanor, because their rehab bar hasn't been enough, we said that this is simply jeopardizing the livelihood of the family members, which cannot live a living wage anymore because the breadwinner is stuck within a prison because of a very minor abuse, but the government wouldn't let him or her go due to some reasons, due to a magical standard of rehabilitation that they cannot tangibly prove. So we see that under both worlds and under both stakeholders, this is extremely damaging to the prisoners, which would be within the prison system and the CJS system in general. So we say that under our last analysis, we say that rehabilitation will be hindered under their world, because we say that when it comes to a fuller picture of rehabilitation, it includes being accepted by the society, and it includes how the others view you as an identity. We say that this wouldn't correspond to the reality as the government is willing to propose, because we like to say that it would be more likely that they're going to reject those criminals that come out after a disproportionately shorter amount of time, even when they have committed a very grievous murder. So due to these reasons, we're extremely happy to oppose.
All right. Can I have the government whip?
Start.
Honorable Chair, I am unclear as to what is the impact coming from closing opposition when they give us bland principles which aren't even factually true as of the status quo. 3 things I'll do in this speech. The first, general tax inside closing opposition why they must take a fall due to a lack of impact. Second, I'll directly engage with opening opposition who has the largest amount of matter in this debate left standing. I'll talk about 2 things. A, on retribution and closure. Secondly, on how we better achieve integration and how we weigh out the types of crimes and how we take the greater debate on this case. First, on closing opposition. They defend status quo, but I don't see the value in analyzing all of this beyond 2 things. A, that punishments in law has to be proportional. This isn't factually true, panel. That for the very same reasons they argued of deterrence on closing and opening half, law and the punishments would never be proportional because only disproportional punishment can instill an amount of fear that dissuades individuals from committing crime. This is why the 3 strikes laws exist in California, where even if you commit 3 petty crimes like theft, you're still going to be punished to a 15-year sentence in jail. That principle itself is not down. Second, they try and reframe this debate by saying this debate isn't about just individuals who commit crimes out of necessity. It's about individuals who commit rape. I'll take this on later on in my comparative, but you cannot deframe this debate by simply saying that this is not the debate and not proving logically any reason why this is true. The fact is that in the vast majority of instances, crimes which are punished by the court are likely petty crimes that were committed out of necessity, because on a simple logical level, more individuals in the world are likely have a need to commit crime in order to self-preserve. There are a lot more homeless individuals that infringe on private property to seek shelter so they don't freeze in the cold. A lot of innocent poor individuals who choose to steal, who choose to rob a bakery in order for to get food to survive. These are instances in which directly hurt a vast majority of individuals, which is unfair for closing opposition to give no reason as to why these individuals are not important. Third thing they say is that the CGS is important for the moral fabric of society, for them to feel safe and secure. And they talk about examples of individuals who feel unsatisfied when they don't see sufficient punishment. So the example they brought forward was likely Brock Turner, right? Who didn't get sufficient punishment even though he raped a college girl. I think we need to extract the direct levels of the people's mental thought when it comes to these problems. We, on Closing Government, will propose that the reasons why they revolted against the Brock Turner trial was because of an innate fear that Brock Turner was going to recommit rape due to the lack of huge sentencing. It wasn't about the harshness of that punishment, because the general belief on your side of the house is that if it's harsh, he will feel fear. The primary principle that we can extract from that is that if you are fearful, you are thereby unlikely to commit the same crime on your side of the house. What we exclusively have on Closing Government is that we have a tangible metric that can measure whether they're going to recommit a crime or not. So if this debate is about safety of individuals, that is something that opposition cannot challenge at all on their side of the house. First thing, on opening opposition, I want to take your eyes in this debate. They want a just criminal system. The first thing I'm talking about is how this is impossible on their side of the house. They claim opposition fiat, but doesn't allow you to claim these measures because their arguments are principally contradictory to these measures. Not putting criminals into cramped spaces and not allowing guards to abuse prisoners or turn a blind eye to prison bullying requires society to view them equally, to not view them as subhuman individuals who deserve punishment. But if you note the language they use, specifically, I quote in verbatim, if you steal now, you're going to do drugs later and do armed robbery later on. You give no reason, no logical analysis as to why prison guards are still not likely to ill-treat these individuals, considering that would be their mentality on your side of the house. Opposition fiat cannot claim a just prison system on their side of the house. You likely still have the same structural problems that John brought to you, i.e. gang violence within systems that force individuals to join gangs in order to self-preserve. We will deal with that later on. We'll talk about recidivism. First main issue of this debate, retribution and closure. The stand coming on Closing Government is that retribution and closure is something that is socially engineered and is highly meanable. In the past, the proportional punishment for stealing is to chop off your arm. In Auschwitz, survivors started an apology acceptance thing when one Auschwitz survivor wrote a letter to her captives acknowledging and saying that she would accept apologies out of those harms because she recognizes that those harms were committed out of need. They were committed because there were instructions that ordered it to do so. On these circumstances, there are two outcomes in which we can draw. First is that people will be normalized to the new lower standard of retribution and closure, which means so long as we are able to ensure there's a generally safer society, as mentioned previously, we're also likely to be able to lower the standards of what people think is acceptable as punishment, considering we still have an amount of sentencing that you have as long as a sentence, so long as you don't prove that you're likely to be a person that will recommit crime. Second outcome is that a lower recidivism rate as a result of our side of the house not letting prisoners out even though they are unproven to be completely safe, completely unlikely going to do crime, again, means there's a general greater acceptance towards ex-convicts as a whole. So the scale of retribution and closure is likely to lower down on our side anyway. But the second, they argue specific closure for crimes like rape and for crimes like murder. We think the closure of victims isn't based on whether the offender is punished sufficiently or not, especially considering the response to retribution, and the response to retribution is always to ensure this individual is never going to recommit that crime. We will give you one structural reason as to why these individuals are likely to do things like accept apologies in these circumstances. We think specifically the unique example that proves this is the Auschwitz survivor, right? That having so much harms inflicted upon you, she still wanted to choose to have forgiveness, proves that having a harboring of hatred is something that's simply not good for individuals on the ground in a general level. Because harboring hatred means you directly contradict and prevent yourself from accessing things like happiness. That every single moment of your life, you're going to harbor hatred of that individual, and you're going to feel as though you needed some greater level of retribution, and that's not something that's genuinely healthy and what people want. Go. Inso. Okay, never mind. So on the second issue is debate on how we lower recidivism rates and we are able to weigh out the harms of criminal acts, right? We are going to tell you that on our side of the house, we would prioritize things like crimes of necessity versus on the other side of health, things like rape. Two things we are going to prove to you, and on two mechanisms we're going to weigh this on you. A, there's the mitigation we have upon individuals commit things like rape and murder. They're unlikely to recommit the crime due to government's mechanism, which we have a fiat upon, which means on a scale in the long term, we have a simply less amount of victims which are likely to be suffering from these kinds of circumstances. So the scale of that is likely in the long term going to become significantly smaller. But on the second comparative, they need to tell you how they completely prevent individuals from recommitting things like murder and rape. Because on your side of the house, you have to specifically deal with the analysis of how prison systems represent a hateful, only perpetuates a sense of hatred within prisoners and a distrust of the state. That the law is always going to be against these individuals and it's only meant to protect individuals who are rich and privileged instead of those who are vulnerable. John gave analysis of prison systems uniquely draining resources. We can rechannel to directly deal with the causations of crime, which is to provide welfare on our side of the house. On your side, you allow right-wingers to scapegoat the need to do so at a point where they can say, oh, we prevent crime by only having retribution, by punishing individuals proportionally. We say crimes of necessity take a precedence debate because they simply affect far more marginalized individuals on a greater scale. We better prevent these harms on our side of the house. Side with proposition.
Thank you. To complete the debate, can I have the opposition with?
Can people hear me?
Start.
Judge and panel, we believe that this debate goes a bit beyond your just classic criminal justice motion about whether or not we should prioritize rehabilitation or retribution. We need to look at this debate in what will actually take place in society once this motion actually comes into play. Not just talking about these theoretical rehabilitation or retribution and whatnot. We need to explore the realistic human nature and reaction. And just because the government says, oh, they don't care, doesn't mean they're not going to. With that said, I'll do a couple of things for you in this debate, in my speech today. First, some couple clarifications and refutations upon the entire Gov bench so far as a whole. And then finally, let's move on into the important questions we need to talk about as to why my member gave valuable content that was never really responded to in this entire debate. First, let's take a look and let's take a broad view of what the government bench is essentially talking about. They essentially push that, look, that rehabilitation is important, that getting criminals out is important. And they impact this twofold. First, they say that, oh, criminals who are in prisons for disproportionately long times are bad, right? Like they're past their prime, they're exposed to violence longer, they come out as worse individuals. First of all, in our world, in the status quo, we think that we can already exercise things like taking into consideration of the circumstances of which to why this certain individual did commit a crime, which was actually said at the very beginning of the opening government speech. But even if that's not the case, right? We talked to you about why it's worse on their side of the house, because now all criminals, no matter what they did, are now looked down upon, which my member talked about, right? Even if you're a person who did very light crime and was disproportionately punished more, we think that the public perception would still kick you down even more by generalizing you as a criminal who did not serve his full sentence. But nevertheless, we think that rehabilitation is something that we can also have on our side of it too, if they're going to argue that they can have retribution as well. But let's move on into the actual focus of the other parts of the debate. Essentially, they talk about, oh, we have retribution and deterrence as well. And their only evidence is some one-liners talking about how they can coexist. Okay, first of all, we think that their argumentation, their logic, for the entire logic for why individuals would just move on and closure would happen is that as long as there is a safe society and people will move on. Unfortunately, this is not really the case. Not all of us are going to be Mother Teresa's and just forgive everybody who wrongs us. We think and the previous speaker said something actually we find quite patronizing, right? You talk about how individuals will live their lives with full of vengeance and anger and fury, right? And they talk about how this is necessarily something that is bad. We want individuals to move on. We think that it's insanely patronizing for them to say that, because why do individuals feel these kinds of emotions? That's how much they have been wronged. They have been stripped of their dignity. They have been stripped of their dignity, perhaps in times of money or whatever, their property, possessions, things that they value. That is why these people are pissed off, and that is the government's job to ensure that this emotion is still regulated or channeled into seeing that this criminal is properly brought to justice, brought into the public eye, not celebrated as somebody who overcame his circumstances, is now successfully rehabilitated. We need to ensure that these individuals who did nothing wrong need to find the closure that they can have simply in this debate. In this debate, and we have that better on our side of the house. Finally, let's move on into their last point about allocation of resources. And we simply think that this is just not going to work under their side of the world, and they already proved it to you in their own speech. First of all, the very beginning of this closing government, the first thing they talked about was that, we also support allocating resources into ensuring that this rehabilitation process is going to be better by having lawyers, consultants, doctors, whatsoever. Okay, if you're going to push all these resources into making sure that these criminals are much more better off, we don't understand why you suddenly get more money than to allocate resources to the poor or for welfare. We think that this on a feasible level, on a practical level, just doesn't work at all. Therefore, this point is ultimately irrelevant. I'll take opening.
Taken.
The problem is that every second spent in jail, more or less than what is needed to rehabilitate, is 1 second. That means that you are less likely to be able to fully rehabilitate the criminal. Where do you draw the line?
Okay, I already responded to this previously, talking about how the vast case of times, individuals who, let's say, we already responded to this point about how an individual who's disproportionately sentenced more would still have a crappier outcome or a worse outcome on the government side of the bench. Therefore, we think that point is taken care of already. Now let's go into the actual constructive, always said. The important questions we need to talk about in this debate are twofold. First, in terms of the victims, which we think is the prioritized actor with this debate. They are probably the most important stakeholder in this debate. And obviously, we believe that we take this debate home on this point. Why? Not only did we talk to you about public reaction and backlash that would ensure that all criminals are perceived as individuals who escape the system, who game the system so they don't have to serve their full-scale punishment. We also talked about how there will be things like rise of vigilantism, or how other individuals would use their rage or use their emotions to do things that are not proportional. That is a worse outcome that they have to deal on their side of the house. At least on our side of the house, we draw a clear social narrative that doing crime is wrong, and therefore you will be appropriately punished, right? If you equate stealing a piece of bread and literally murdering numerous amount of people as you're still going to go to the psychiatric hospital, we think that the narrative that we're sending out to society is incredibly dangerous, something that the government side has on their side of the house. But finally, we need to talk about the stakeholder of actors, which is our second question. First of all, we already talked about individuals who commit non-violent crimes per se. We already talked about this in our previous speakers. But secondly, we think that the individuals who benefit the most due to their policy are people who commit very, very heavy crimes. And first of all, let me point out that criminals don't commit crime because they think that the crime is necessarily good. The individuals who want to see the world burn are a huge minority. And we think that the individuals who commit crime most of the time are people who think that they're not going to get caught, something the government actually pointed out themselves. So in fact, these people who are committing crimes know that their crimes are bad. And especially for individuals who are more powerful. For example, Harvey Weinstein, right? Under their policy, he would be rehabilitated in a very short time, and he would still come out just fine in a very short time. We think that not only is this a huge offense to the public and to the victims that he has offended and wronged for so many years, but we also think that this opens up gates for individuals to commit crimes, knowing that the consequence is you going to be pitied upon and you being seen as a person who needs help anyways by the government. Because of these reasons, we are very proud to oppose this motion.
Reflection.